The winter night had fallen heavy across this small American village, the kind of place where smoke curled from stone chimneys and lanterns flickered weakly against the wind. Snow came down hard, blanketing the ground and burying fences, barns, and wagon-wheeled in silence. It was the kind of night when the roads disappeared and every step felt like a battle with the elements. Out on the edge of the village, past the black silhouettes of cottonwood trees and fields, now frozen solid, a young woman stumbled through the cold, her breath breaking into sharp clouds as the storm swallowed her whole. She hadn't planned to be caught in the dark, nor so far from town, but fate rarely asked permission. Her thin shawl clung to her shoulders, the fabric too light for the punishing wind. She held it close, though it did little to stop the snow from sneaking in against. Her skin, her boots were already soaked, the leather stiff with ice. She kept pushing forward, her body driven by something stronger than fear, though her legs trembled with every step. Behind her, the storm howled through the empty fields, a sound that could chill even the strongest heart. Ahead, she could just make out the long shadow of a barn. Half buried beneath drifts, its roof sharp against the stormy sky, the barn stood lonely and dark. But to her, it was a promise of shelter. She quickened her pace, her breath coming faster, though the cold dragged at her lungs. When she finally reached the heavy wooden door, she pressed her weight against it, forcing it open just enough to slip inside. The smell of hay and horse lingered earthy and familiar, wrapping around her like a memory of warmth. She shut the door against the wind and sagged against the wood, her fingers stiff, her body shaking. It was quiet inside except for the shifting of an old mare in the stall. Animal's breath rose in soft clouds, and the woman felt comforted by its presence. She stumbled toward the hay stacked high in the corner, her legs barely obeying her will. Falling to her knees, she tried to bury herself in the straw, but the numbness had already spread too far. Her thoughts grew scattered, her eyelids heavy, and as the storm raged outside, she wondered if this lonely barn would be the last place she would ever know. She did not hear the approach of hoofbeats cutting through the snow, nor the groan of saddle leather as a rider dismounted outside. She did not see the tall figure who pushed open the barn door a moment later, snow-dusting his hat and shoulders. The man paused in the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the dim light he had not expected. To find anyone here? The land was quiet, his neighbors few and far, and this barn was part of his family's ranch. But there she was, a small figure curled weakly among the hay, her lips pale, her breathing shallow. He moved toward her quickly, his boots crunching softly on the straw. Kneeling, he touched her shoulder and felt the unnatural chill through her shawl. She stirred faintly, her eyes flickering open, but no words came. The man's face tightened with concern. He was a rancher, used to harsh weather and the unforgiving land, but seeing her like this struck him deeper than he cared to admit. Her fragility pulled at something inside him that had been silent for years. He knew she wouldn't last much longer here. The barn was cold, the storm relentless. Lifting her carefully into his arms, he felt how light she was, as though the winter had stripped her strength away. He carried her out into the snow, his jaw set against the wind, and made his way toward the ranch house that sat beyond the corral. His boots cut deep into the drifts, but he moved with steady determination. The weight of her against his chest, reminding him that every second mattered. Inside the house, the fire in the hearth glowed low but steady. He laid her gently on a bed near the flames, removing the ice-soaked shawl and wrapping her in a quilt heavy with wool. She shivered still, her eyes half closed, and he sat beside her, feeding more wood into the fire until the flames roared high and bright. The warmth began to push back the edge of the cold, though it would take time before the life returned fully to her cheeks, as the storm battered the walls outside. The man sat watchful, his thoughts restless. He had lived much of his life apart. A man tied to the land, his heritage caught between two worlds, Apache by blood, yet bound to the ranching life his family carved out of the wilderness. Neighbors respected his strength, but he was always seen as different, carrying a silence that few dared to cross. And now, here in his home, was a stranger who had stumbled into his life on the cruelest night of winter. Her breathing steadied little by little, and color touched her lips once more. She opened her eyes and for the first time really looked at him. There was confusion in her gaze, perhaps fear, but also gratitude. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. He raised a hand gently, telling her without words to rest, and she obeyed, her head sinking back against the pillow. Still, the flicker of her eyes lingered on him, as though some unspoken bond had already been set between them. Hours passed. The fire held strong, and the house grew warm enough to chase away the shadows of death that had clung to her when he first found her. She stirred again, this time whispering something soft, almost lost to the crackle of the fire, leaned close, catching only fragments of her words, something about being lost, about the storm taking her by surprise. Her voice faded, and he saw the tears welling in her eyes before she turned her face away. The rancher sat back, his expression hardening, not with anger but with thought. Was no ordinary traveler. There was a story behind those tears, behind the way she had braved the snow alone, and he intended to learn it. But not tonight. Tonight, it was enough that she was alive, that the storm had not claimed her. Still, the questions pressed at him, heavy as the wind outside. Who was she? Had she come from? And what kind of fate had brought her to his barn on the very night she might have frozen beneath its rafters? As the storm quieted into the silence of midnight, the rancher leaned back in his chair, the firelight painting shadows across his face. She slept fitfully, safe for now, but the air between them carried an unspoken tension, as if destiny itself had drawn their paths together. He did not yet know that the night's rescue was only the beginning, that in the warmth of his home, under the weight of winter's silence, a love story waited to be written. Yet even as the fire glowed and her breathing steadied, the world outside held its secrets. Tomorrow would bring questions neither of them could avoid, and choices that might change both of their lives forever. For now, she rested in the bed of a man she barely knew, while he sat in the dim firelight, wondering what storm truly had entered his home, the one outside in the snow, or the one that had just begun in his heart. The morning came slow, with a gray light spreading across the ranch and pushing against the heavy clouds that still lingered after the storm. The land outside was buried deep in snow, fences nearly swallowed, trees bent low, and the barn roof glittering with ice. The rancher stood by the window, watching the quiet fields, his hand resting on the wooden frame. He had seen many winters, and each one left its mark on the land and on him. But something about this morning felt different. Behind him, in the warmth of the house, the woman stirred, her breath steady now. Though her body was still weak from the cold, he turned to her, his dark eyes studying the stranger in his bed. She had a look of someone caught between fear and exhaustion, her face pale, her lips faintly trembling even in rest. The quilt wrapped around her seemed to swallow her whole, and though the fire burned bright in the hearth, she clung to the heat as if afraid it would vanish. He wondered again what had brought her here, alone and unprepared. On a night that might have taken her life, when her eyes opened, she did not move at first. She only watched the ceiling beams, her lashes heavy, as though she were gathering the courage to face the day. At last, she shifted, glancing at him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the silence of the house grew heavy. She tried to sit up, her hands clutching at the quilt, but he stepped forward quickly, steadying her with a firm hand. "You're safe," he said quietly, his voice deep but even. The storms passed. She swallowed hard, her gaze flicking around the small room, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the strong fire, and the figure of the man who had carried her from the edge of death. Her lips parted as if to thank him, but the words faltered. Instead, she whispered, "I didn't mean to trespass." His jaw tightened at her choice of words. Trespass. To him, it was not trespass, not when life hung in the balance. "You would have frozen in that barn," he answered. "No one would have found you till spring." Her hands clutched the quilt tighter. She gave a small nod, but her eyes lowered quickly, hiding something. There was more to her story, he could see it as clear as the tracks in snow, but she wasn't ready to give it. Not yet. The fire cracked and hissed. Outside, the sound of a horse pawing, the snow drifted faintly through the walls. He reached for his coat hanging by the door, pulling it over his shoulders. "Rest here," he told her. "I'll tend to." The stock. When the door shut behind him, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, yet her heart remained uneasy. She hadn't expected to survive the night. Now she found herself in the home of a man whose presence carried both safety and uncertainty. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. Memories pressed to close the reason she'd been. Caught in the storm, the fear that still shadowed her every step. She pushed it down, holding it close to herself, for trust was not something easily given. The rancher returned not long after, his boots heavy with snow, his hat dusted white. He moved about the house with quiet efficiency, setting wood by the fire, checking her again without a word of complaint, then stepping to the stove where a pot of coffee simmered. The smell filled the room, warm and bitter. He poured a cup and set it on the table, glancing at her as if inviting her to take it when she was able. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the wind outside. At last, she asked softly, "This land, it's yours?" He nodded once. "Family's land. Been hours since before the town grew up out there." There was pride in his voice, but also something quieter, something weighted. She could hear it even in those few words. She dared another question. "And you? You live here alone?" Pause, then another nod. His eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. Did not explain further, but the answer was enough. She felt a pang of curiosity mixed with something deeper. The day moved slow, the storm leaving behind a world locked in ice. By afternoon, the faint sound of wagon wheels creaked along the road that cut near the ranch. Voices drifting faintly through the frosted air. Word would spread quickly in town once folks saw the smoke rising from his chimney. In a village that small, everything was noticed and everything was spoken of. The people respected the Apache rancher for his strength and skill, but whispers followed him too about his blood, his solitude, and the way he kept to himself. Now, if they learned that a strange woman had found her way into his house during the storm, the gossip would spread faster than fire on dry grass. Inside, the woman shifted again, pushing herself to sit despite the weakness still tugging at her limbs. Her gaze roamed the room, settling on a rifle hanging above the door, on the saddle resting by the wall, on the worn Bible sitting quietly on the shelf. Each detail spoke of the man who lived here, practical, hardened, yet not untouched by faith. She wanted to ask more, to break the silence that pressed so heavy, but her own secret held her tongue. She wasn't ready to explain why she'd been walking alone through the storm. Why her eyes still held the look of someone running from something unseen. She thought, perhaps he saw it anyway, for his eyes lingered on her with a steady weight, as though he could read more than she spoke. When the sun began to sink behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and blue, he returned from the barn again, his face flushed from the cold. He set a pot of stew on the fire and handed her a bowl when it was ready. She accepted it with trembling hands, the warmth of the food spreading through her in a way that nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You should rest another night," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. She looked at him quickly, startled. Another night beneath his roof meant more questions, more closeness, more risk. Yet the thought of leaving while the snow still lay so deep filled her with dread. She gave a slow nod, though uncertainty stirred in her chest. The fire burned long into the night. Shadows dancing on the walls. Lay beneath the quilt, listening to the steady sound of his boots crossing the floor, the creak of his chairs. He sat near the window, always watchful. It was as though he was guarding more than the house, more than the livestock outside. And perhaps, in some quiet way, he was guarding her too. Sleep finally claimed her, though dreams came uneasy. She saw flashes of faces from the town, sharp words, a door closing hard behind her. She saw the storm rise again, endless and cruel. And through it all, she saw his figure standing tall, the firelight cutting across his strong features. She woke in the early hours. The storm had gone, but the unease remained. He was still by the window, silent as ever. When she stirred, his eyes shifted to her, and in that gaze she felt both comfort and questions, too deep for words. She turned her face away, pulling the quilt closer. She knew the time was coming when she would have to speak, when her secret would no longer stay hidden. But not yet. For now, the ranch house stood as a fragile shelter. Two strangers bound together by a storm, their paths crossing at the edge of winter's cruelty. Outside, the snow stretched endless, the village beyond holding whispers and judgments. And somewhere in the distance, trouble waited, patient as a wolf in the dark. The rancher did not ask again that night. He only kept watch, his thoughts unspoken. The fire burning low, yet in his silence, a storm of another kind was already gathering. One that would test both their hearts in ways they could not yet see. The snow did not melt quickly. For days the land stayed locked under its white burden. And in that time the woman remained at the ranch house. Each morning she would wake to the sound of the rancher moving about, splitting wood, tending to the horses, carrying buckets of water that steamed against the bitter air. She stayed close to the fire, slowly regaining her strength, though the weight of her secret pressed harder with each passing day. She owed him her life, yet fear kept her from speaking. When she tried to help with small tasks, he would shake his head, telling her quietly to rest. His words were few, but they carried a steady care. She noticed how his hands, though rough, from years of ranch work, moved with patience when he set a cup of broth before her or adjusted the quilt across her shoulders. There was a gentleness there that surprised her, one that seemed at odds with the hardness the town often whispered about him. Still, the world outside could not be kept at bay forever. On the fourth day, the crunch of wagon wheels broke the quiet. A neighbor stopped by, stamping the snow from his boots as he knocked at the door. The rancher let him in, and for the first time the woman saw how others looked at him. The neighbor greeted him with a kind of careful respect, his eyes sharp as they flicked past the rancher to where she sat by the fire. He asked about the storm, about the cattle, about the condition of the roads, but beneath it all was curiosity. Who was she? The rancher gave no explanation, only said she had been caught in the storm and was recovering. The neighbor nodded, though the look he gave told her the story would not stop there. By nightfall the town would be buzzing. She felt the knot of dread tighten in her chest. That evening, after the neighbor left, she turned to him. "Talk," she whispered. "They always do," he answered simply, his voice low and even. But she could see it troubled him. Not because of what they thought of him, he had long grown used to, that because now the gossip would circle around her too. She wanted to tell him then, to explain why she had been on that road, why she had left the safety of the town in the middle of a storm. But the words stuck. She feared what he would think, what others might do if the truth came to light. Instead, she only lowered her eyes and fell silent, leaving the fire to fill the room with its restless crackle. The next morning, the sound of riders carried across the frozen land. She peered through the window and saw two men on horseback slowing near the corral. They did not dismount, only lingered long enough to glance at the house before riding on. Her stomach knotted. She recognized their faces, men who often sat at the saloon, quick with laughter, but quicker with cruelty. She had crossed their path before, and not kindly. The rancher noticed her stiffen and stepped beside her. His gaze followed the riders. As they disappeared into the distance, he said nothing, but his eyes darkened. She knew he had read more in her silence than she had meant to reveal. As days passed, the tension grew heavier. Storm had bound them together. But now, the outside world was pressing closer. At night she dreamed of the saloon, of harsh voices and a hand gripping her wrist too tightly. She would wake with a start, the fire's glow steadying her. Sometimes she would see the rancher watching quietly from his chair, as though he knew the shadows chasing her. One afternoon, as she helped gather kindling near the barn, she paused. At the sight of the land stretched wide before her, the snow had begun to soften, and in the distance she could see the faint smoke of chimneys rising from the village. Life went on, but she could not return there, not yet. She turned back toward the barn, where the horses stirred, and for a moment she felt a fragile peace. But then she heard voices, carried faintly on the wind, two men speaking, their laughter sharp. She froze, her heart racing. The rancher stepped out from the barn, his eyes scanning the hills. He heard it too. Without a word, he guided her back toward the house. She sensed the weight in his silence, a readiness in the set of his shoulders. He was no stranger to danger, she realized with a sudden jolt, that her presence here might be dragging that danger to his doorstep. Inside, as night fell, she finally spoke. "You should have left me in that barn," she said, her voice low but fierce. He turned to her, his eyes steady. "You'd be dead." "Better than bringing trouble here," she whispered. Clutching the quilt around her, his jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. He crossed the room, adding wood to the fire, the sparks leaping high. At last he said, "This land has seen trouble before. It can stand more." She looked at him, her throat tight. He spoke as though the land itself gave him strength, as though every hardship had been woven into his bones. Yet she couldn't shake the fear that she had brought more than a passing storm into his life. In the days that followed, the village grew restless. Whispers traveled from the mercantile to the church, from the saloon to the blacksmith's forge. Some said the woman was a runaway. Others claimed she carried scandal with her, that she was hiding from shame. The rancher heard the talk when he went into town for supplies, though no one dared say it to his face. But their eyes followed him, and their glances carried weight. When he returned, she read the strain in his silence. "They'll never understand," she said softly. "They don't need to," he answered. But she knew better. In a town that small, everyone's life was tied to everyone else's. Secrets had no place to hide. That night, as the wind shifted outside and the coyotes howled on the ridge, the rancher stood at the window again. She watched him from the bed, her heart heavy with both fear and something she could not yet name. She wondered how long he would bear her presence before the weight grew too heavy. And she wondered, too, what would happen when those men who laughed on the hillside came back, not with passing words, but with purpose. The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows in the lines of his jaw. He did not speak, but his hand rested near the rifle above the door. She turned away, clutching the quilt. Knowing that the storm, which had nearly taken her life, was nothing compared to the one waiting just beyond the horizon, the thaw came slow. But with it came movement on the roads. Wagons rattled again between the village and the outlying ranches. Riders passed along the frozen creek bed. The quiet the storm had given was gone. With every day the woman stayed, she felt the noose of gossip tightening. She could almost hear it in the way the church bell rang, sharper than before, or in the way voices hushed when she thought of town. She knew they were speaking her name. Tying it now to his, the rancher, though steady as ever, carried a weight in his eyes. He had always been set apart Apache by blood, rancher by trade,
while longing fully to neither world in the eyes of those who judged.
His solitude had kept the whispers at bay before, but with her in his home, the whispers had become sharper, louder. And though he never spoke of it, she could see the way his jaw tightened when he returned from town, the way his hand lingered near the rifle above the door at night. One evening he came back later than usual, snow clinging to his coat, his face carved with weariness. She rose from the chair by the fire, her heart pounding as she saw the shadow in his expression. "They're asking questions," he said simply, hanging his coat on the peg. Not kindly. She swallowed hard. "About me. About both of us." His voice was low, steady, but she could hear the edge beneath it. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. She wanted to confess everything then, to lay bare the truth she'd carried like a stone in her chest since the night of the storm. But fear gripped her, fear not only of what he might think, but of what others might do once her story was known. Instead, she pressed her hands together, trembling. "They'll come here," she whispered. His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. "Let them." But she knew the town knew how suspicion could turn into something uglier, sharper, worse. She knew the men who had ridden past the corral days ago. They were not content to let talk do the work. Their kind preferred their own brand of judgment, swift and merciless. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the shifting of the horses in the barn, the wind pushing against the shutters, the quiet rhythm of his breathing from the chair by the window. Every sound pressed on her nerves. Every shadow on the wall seemed alive with threat. She turned the quilt in her hands, fighting back the memories that threatened to overwhelm her, voices raised in anger, a hand gripping her too tightly. The fear that had driven her out into the storm. By morning, she was pale with exhaustion. He noticed but said nothing, only set a bowl of food before her and reminded her to eat. His silence was not unkind, it was protective. She realized, but it made her secret feel heavier still. The days blurred into a tense waiting. Each time a rider appeared on the ridge, her heart leaped. Each time the rancher rode into town for supplies, she feared he would not return. The village was stirring, the rumors spreading faster, and the men who thrived on trouble were circling closer. One afternoon, the sound of hooves came fast and hard, breaking the still air. She rushed to the window, her breath catching as 3 riders pulled up near the barn. Their faces were familiar, hard, sneering. Men who had laughed too loud in the saloon, who had cornered her once with words sharp as knives. She stepped back, fear crawling up her throat. The rancher was outside before they could dismount. He stood tall, his hat low against the sun, his hand resting near the rifle slung at his side. The men spoke, their voices too low for her to hear, but their gestures were sharp, taunting. She pressed her hand against the glass, willing him to stay calm, yet knowing the storm had already broken. One of the men pointed toward the house, his voice rising, carrying across the snow. She could not make out the words, but she knew what they meant. They wanted her. They wanted answers. And if they could not take them with words, they would take them with force. Her knees weakened, but she stayed at the window, unable to look away. The rancher's voice cut through the cold air, calm but firm. He did not move from his place, his body blocking the path to the house. The men shifted uneasily on their horses, their laughter turning bitter. The standoff stretched thin as a wire ready to snap with one wrong word. Finally, they pulled their reins and turned away, their curses trailing behind them. But she knew it was not over. It was only beginning. That night the ranch was quieter than ever. The fire burned low, and he sat at the window with the rifle across his lap, his eyes never leaving the darkness outside. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with fear. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "And when they come," her voice trailed off. He looked at her, his face hard in the firelight. "We'll be ready." But she wasn't sure if readiness would be enough. She knew what men like that were capable of. She knew the village would not stand against them, not for her, not for him. The days grew heavier, the tension thick as smoke. Every knock at the door made her flinch. Every sound of hoofbeats in the distance sent her heart racing. The rancher spoke little, but his actions spoke plenty, of stockpiling wood, checking the horses, cleaning his rifle. He moved like a man preparing for a storm that could not be outrun. And then, as the moon rose one cold night, the dogs began to bark. She sat up in bed, her blood turning to ice. Outside, the sound of horses filled the air more than before. A group, this time, voices carrying, rough and angry. The glow of torches flickered against the snow, casting long, shifting shadows across the land. She rose, clutching the quilt to her chest, her breath sharp with terror. He was already at the door, rifle in hand, his silhouette strong against the firelight. "They've come," she whispered, her voice breaking. He glanced back at her, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. "Stay inside." The torches drew closer, the voices louder, sharper, filled with rage. The sound of horses pawing at the snow echoed like thunder. The rancher stepped outside, the door closing behind him, leaving her alone in the glow of the fire, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear. Through the window she saw them, 6 men, their shadows long, their faces twisted in the firelight. They encircled him, shouting, demanding. The cold air carried the sting of their words, though she could not make them out. Her hands trembled against the glass. She wanted to run, to hide, to scream, but she could do nothing except watch as the standoff built to a breaking point. The rancher stood tall, unyielding, a single figure against the circle of torchlight and steel. The snow crunched under restless hooves, the shouts rose higher. and the night pressed in as though the whole world was holding its breath. And in that moment she knew the storm outside the barn had only been a warning. The true storm had come, and there would be no hiding from it now. The night hung heavy, the torches blazing in the snow as the men circled the rancher. Their voices clashed with the wind, bitter with accusation and anger. From the window, the woman pressed her hand against the glass, her breath fogging the pain, her heart aching as she watched. She had never wanted this fight to come to his doorstep. Yet here it was, men full of pride and cruelty, eager to break what they did not understand. One of them rode closer, his horse stamping hard against the frozen ground. He shouted words that cut through the night, demanding she be handed over, demanding answers that were not his to take. The rancher stood his ground, his rifle steady in his hands, but not yet raised. His voice, though quiet, carried a power that made even the wind pause. He told them no, told them she was under his protection, and no man would drag her away from his house. The men roared with anger at that. Horses pawed, steel flashed, and for a moment it seemed the snow itself would crack under the weight of the fury. The woman's legs trembled, but something inside her broke free. She could not stay silent any longer, not while he stood alone against a crowd stirred up by her own hidden truth. She threw the quilt from her shoulders, rushed to the door, stepped out into the biting cold. The torches lit her face as she stood at his side, her breath streaming in the frozen air. The men turned their eyes to her, their voices rising, with taunts, but she did not shrink back. Her voice wavered at first, then grew stronger as she spoke the truth. She told them why she had left the town, why she had run into the storm. She spoke of the cruelty she had suffered, of how she had been cornered, how no one had lifted a hand to stop it. She told them she had chosen the road rather than live another day. Under their jeers and their threats, the crowd shifted uneasily. Some muttered, some spat, but others lowered their eyes. The rancher stood beside her, silent but fierce, his hand steady on the rifle, though he did not need to raise it. For once her voice was the weapon, cutting sharper than steel. One of the men who had taunted her most sneered, ready to strike back with words, but others pulled at his reins, dragging him away. Doubt had been planted in the circle. The fire of anger flickered uncertainly. At last, with curses tossed into the night, the group turned their horses and rode back toward the village. The torches disappearing into the distance, the snow fell. Quiet again. The rancher lowered his rifle, his breath heavy in the frozen air. She trembled at his side, not from the cold, but from the release of what she had carried inside for so long. He turned to her, his eyes steady, filled not with judgment but with a quiet pride. Inside the house once more, the fire burned low. She sat close to it, her hands shaking as she cradled a cup of coffee he set before her. For the first time, the weight in her chest felt lighter. She had spoken her truth, and though the village would still whisper, though the men might not forgive, she no longer hid from it. The rancher sat across from her, his face calm, though the firelight caught the faint lines of weariness in his eyes. "They won't let it rest easy," he said, his voice low. She nodded. "I know, but I can't keep running." Silence stretched between them, but it was not the heavy silence of before. It was filled with something new: understanding, trust, the fragile thread of hope. The days that followed were tense but steady. News spread quickly through the town, and though gossip still stirred, it carried less force than before. Some pitied her, some turned cold, but others began to look with new eyes at the men who had once spoken so loud against her. The storm of voices in the saloon lost some of its strength, and though no one said it outright, the fact that the rancher had stood beside her, unflinching, kept worse trouble from rising. Together, they settled into a rhythm. She helped with the chores, learning the ways of the land, her hands roughened, but her spirit steadier. The ranch, once a place of solitude, grew warmer with her presence. The quiet moments between them deepened, sharing bread at the table, tending to the fire, walking along the fence lines as the snow began to thaw. Spring crept slowly over the hills, snow receding to reveal green shoots pushing through the earth. The horses grew restless with the change of season. The cattle stretched their legs in pastures, once locked tight in ice. With the thaw came a sense of renewal, as though the land itself had chosen to forgive the winter's cruelty. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a section of fence, she paused, leaning on the post. She looked out across the wide land, the mountains in the distance, the sky opening with promise. Her voice was soft when she spoke. "I thought I was finished the night I nearly froze by your barn. I thought there was nothing left for me but silence." He set down the hammer, looking at her with eyes as deep as the land itself. "But you weren't finished," he said. Her lips trembled into a faint smile. "I wasn't. Not because of me, because of you." He shook his head gently. "No, because you had strength still. I only gave you shelter." She met his gaze, and in that look was all the truth she had come to know, that survival was not always a matter of strength alone, but of finding the hand willing to pull you from the storm. By the time the first blossoms appeared along the creek bed, the village had quieted. The men who had come with torches no longer dared ride near the ranch. Their shame lingered, and though they never spoke it, their absence was its own confession. The woman no longer walked in fear. She entered town at the rancher's side. Some looked away, some whispered still, but others nodded in respect. Change came slow, but it came. In the evenings, when the sun sank behind the mountains and painted the sky in gold and violet, they would sit together on the porch, the land stretching wide before them. She would rest her head against the wood, listening to the stillness. He would sit beside her, his presence steady, his silence no longer a wall, but a comfort. She knew the story of how she had come. Here would always remain with her that night of snow, the barn, the fire that had saved her. But she also knew it was no longer the end of her journey. It was the beginning. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a place of renewal. The man once judged as an outsider had become her anchor, her shield, her home. And she, once broken by fear, had found her voice again, as the first warm winds of summer swept across the valley. Carrying with them the scent of grass and wildflowers, she looked at the land with new eyes. The hardships were not over life. On the frontier never promised ease, but the shadows that had once followed her no longer held their grip. She turned to him, her voice quiet but certain. "I think I was meant to find this place, meant to find you." He did not answer at once. He only looked out at the horizon, the lines of the mountains dark against the sky. At last he said, "Sometimes the storm leads you where you need to be." The words lingered in the evening air, simple yet full of truth. She reached for his hand, and he let it rest in hers. Steady and strong, the wind rustled through the grass, the last snow melting into the earth, and the night settled peaceful over the ranch. Whatever storms had yet to come, they would face them together. And in that quiet, the firelight glowing through the window and the land stretching endless around them, their story found its ending not in the storm that nearly claimed her, but in the shelter that had given her a new beginning.